Alright, it's day 33 of Muscle Music, a series in which I pick an album from this filter, I work out to it, and I give my thoughts on it, and I only do albums I've never listened to before. I can't do Joni Mitchell's Blue because it's not on streaming, but I've listened to it before. It's a great album. I don't think it's number 3 all time, but it's definitely great. Prince's Sign of the Times, let's do it.
When a rocket ship explodes, and everybody's still.
Alright, we're back from the gym. We did our cardio today, and then my roommate actually texted me to play some basketball, so I am exhausted, but here are my thoughts on Prince's Sign of the Times. So I previously did an episode on Purple Rain, which was Prince's most critically acclaimed best-selling record, and I don't really want to directly compare it to that one, but I just fell in love with Purple Rain, probably one of my favorite records I've done on this series so far, and this one just doesn't really live up to that same kind of feeling. Don't get me wrong, Prince is a great performer. Obviously, I loved his last record. I love a lot of singles that he has put out in his career. Got to be one of the best artists of the 80s, but that's one of my main issues with this record is that it just sounds so stuck in the 80s. A lot of the drum patterns and percussion throughout the whole album is performed by a drum machine. And he even swaps out some of the instrumentation with just straight up synthesizers. So while that can sound pretty good in certain scenarios, stretched over an hour and 20 minutes, it's a little rough because this is a double album. And I think a lot of that sound, that electronic sound, almost like a DIY sound in a sense, even though this is a very large, very highly produced album, I think a lot of that sound is because this is his first album after he left Prince and The Revolution. So this is his first solo outing. And that makes a lot more sense once you understand that. I also feel like this album has a bit of an identity crisis in a sense because it doesn't really understand what genre it kind of sits in. And I know you can have a lot more different genres and branch out into many different things, but it's kind of in that R&B, soul, funk sound, but I've seen people describe it as avant pop in a sense, which doesn't really make sense to me. But, I mean, it was, for the most part, it was still pretty listenable. And I feel like that's really a lot of what I have to say about the album is that it's pretty listenable. Granted, it is an hour and 20 minutes. So if you're not into it for the full thing, it's not going to be your thing. I totally get that. But as someone who's slowly becoming a Prince fan, you know, it was still a pretty decent album. I don't know if I would work out to it too much, but it was a lot better than some of the other albums I did for this show. Prince also dives into getting a pseudonym or an alter ego for this album, where he just kind of pitch shifts his voice a little bit higher, and I believe it's her name is Camille, so it's a female that he's trying to kind of have this alter ego with, and it comes into play in a couple of tracks. If I Was Your Girlfriend, there's this whole monologue of oh well, if we're not dating, I can still get naked in front of you, and it dives into some weird territory later in the album, but for the most part, I think he plays it off pretty well. So for the most part, you know, it is a bit of a longer album, but it's not nearly as grand or as epic as I kind of hoped it would be, especially in comparison to Purple Rain. And again, I don't really want to compare the two, but that album is 20 minutes shorter, and it just feels like this huge grand statement where this really doesn't have too much to say in terms of messaging or themes. I also really didn't know this until now, but the amount of output that Prince has throughout his whole discography is insane. Especially for this run in the 80s, it was very incredible. He put out an album a year for almost 15 years. His output was insane. So just thought I'd put that in. Still though, I'd be lying if I didn't say this album didn't have its highlights. My favorite tracks have to go to You Got the Look, probably my favorite single that was released for this. Hot Stuff, as well as Adore, the closing track, which was actually one of the most touching tracks on the album. I really like that one. So yeah, while I wasn't really head over heels for this record, I still thought it was very listenable, very enjoyable. Still had a lot of that eccentric Prince flair that you really want on an album. It was just a little too long and doesn't really have the same amount of highlights as some other records. And I wonder why this album was put on and not an album let's say 1999, or even his self-titled, or, you know, some of the other records that were released in that run in the 80s. It's just very interesting to see why this one was put on there, because it's a little bit longer. It's an hour and 20 minutes, and it just doesn't have that epicness that some of his other releases do, but still pretty good. If I had to give it a rating, I'm probably going to sit around a high 6, a mid to high 6. It wasn't really my thing, but still pretty good. Like and follow for more unless this app gets banned. Goodbye.